373-3366 so that you can get the latest and the greatest about the conference. Guess what? Just show up on Saturday. We're having a reunion. And so, starting on Friday, on the 14th, the 15th, it's just an absolute reunion for people who were involved in the presidential campaigns. But we want you to be there because you should hear the stories from the people who created the story, right? And then that's Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Vice President Harris and presidential candidates, and on and on and on. It's going to be great. And we are going to have a financial literacy panel. That's right. Make It Financial is really at the center of that, my new sponsor here. We want you to become financially literate. No matter how much money you make or how little in your own eyes, there's a way for you to plan for a retirement. And there's a way for you to plan on investments and things like that. And you need to talk to people who do not just deal with high net worth individuals. In fact, their target are middle class and working class people. And that will be on the 18th. I cannot wait for that panel. So everybody call me at 773 Freedom, 773 Freedom throughout the week and starting at 9 o'clock today. But today, I'm coming to you from WCPT 820, the nation's largest progressive talk radio station. And we're going to be talking about, we'll be talking with John Nichols about Ukraine and the NATO meeting. What does all of this mean? But we also want to talk with you today about the robust efforts that Republicans have mounted to suppress the vote. And they're happening all over the country. I mean, as the corporate media is focusing you on the Trump campaign, there are voter suppression measures that could pass the U.S. House of Representatives. That's right. And they are being put forth in state legislatures all across the country. It will be much harder to vote. That is why we need President Biden to give us an executive order on voting rights. It will only last the length of his presidency. But if we don't get those, that's the margin of victory for the Democrats. It's always been black and brown people, and especially the black vote. Well, what's going to happen here? We've got to talk about that. And that's a big, 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 big deal. So I want you to call me at 773 Freedom. No, excuse me, 773 WCPT, 773 WCPT. And let's talk about these Republican efforts to turn back the clock on the vote. No one's talking about it. And it's just amazing to me that no one is talking about the turning back the clock, if you will, on the vote. It's just stunning because that's how Democrats win. Democrats win when more people vote. Democrats win, and you win. I mean, and I'm not, I go beyond partisanship. I'm talking about everybody winning. Because guess what? If a Republican goes in office, you still need to negotiate with them, push them to do what you need them to do, because they might be Republican Party presidents, but they are your president too, no matter who and what. And so we have to grow up in our politics and demand that whoever occupies a seat that represents us, since it's our dollars that pay for them to be there, that they represent us. So that means you need to register to vote, you need to march, you need to call, you need to do everything you need to do, because that is how politics is done, everybody. That is how politics is done. Just in a few of these headlines, NATO, well, it looks like they're going to have a new member. That's right. Turkey's President Erdogan has agreed to secure parliamentary approval for Sweden to join the NATO alliance after a year of blocking the move. We need to know what happened with that. That's right. Anti-government protests have erupted in Israel once again after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu revived judicial overhaul plans that demonstrators say will undermine the nation's democracy. As the American South continues to experience dangerous extreme heat, parts of the Northeast are being drenched by heavy rains and flash flooding. Vermont has been hit especially hard, everybody. The state saw more than 50 water rescues yesterday as safety officials are concerned rivers could crest and dams could overflow today, everybody. It's wow. What do you think, everybody? What do you think? Please be careful. That's all I'm going to say. In Chicago, we're going to have a beautiful day, partly cloudy. 83 degrees will be the high. Minneapolis, St. Paul, 79 degrees. It'll be clear. All-star game tonight, everybody. Home run derby for the first time. A son succeeded the father as the home run champion. Love it, love it, love it. Congratulations. All-star game tonight, National League versus the American League. Who do you think is going to win? Well, the National League are the underdogs, and the American League is favored to win, but it's anybody's game. We will see tonight in the WNBA tomorrow. The Sun will be facing off against the Sky, and the Wings will be facing off against the Lynx. But the ladies have the night off. I guess so we can all watch the All Star game, right? And tomorrow, Chicago will be facing off against Montreal in soccer, and the league and guess what? The Houston Dynamos will be facing off against Minneapolis. And those are just some of the headlines on the Santita Jackson Show. We have got Pastor Stephen Thurston. Pastor Stephen Thurston, it is a joy always to be with you. Talk to me about some good news, but first, we can get together with you because you have these wonderful get-togethers on Facebook at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time on Facebook Live. Yes. Mm, absolutely. I mean, because everybody's going through the same thing. Everybody. I mean, just in one way or another. It's nothing is unique. Please, no shame, no blame. Everybody take responsibility. Okay. Immature people blame. Mature people take responsibility for the good and the not so good that they do, and you keep on going. Well, getting better along the way. Let me just let me put that in there. Ooh. But what's going on? What's the good news today? Can you hear me now? Can you hear him? No, can okay. No, I'm just trying. I'm trying to go through all the different settings. I need to know if you can hear. What about now? Just as,
It's just the toxic
what about
voice.
now?
Number two, notice how you speak to yourself.
Now I can hear him.
Okay,
Toxic
thank you.
environment may have left screen burned, and you'll find yourself responding to things that aren't even there presently. You got to get those thoughts out of your head and on the paper, and like a scientist, explore them. I want you to be on the lookout for what your inner voice is telling you and correct it when necessary. Third and finally, embrace who you are. Toxic relationships often lead us to hide or deny important parts of ourselves. Find moments of stillness, quiet time to listen for what's going on and what's longing inside of you to be expressed. Look inward for urges that may be suppressed and make space for more authentic experience with yourself. Stand firm in who you are unapologetically as you move forward in life. Now listen, each time you catch an old pattern you picked up in that toxic space, turn it a victory and proof that you're progressing. You acknowledge it. You notice it now. The fact that you're noticing these things means you're learning, you're growing, and you're coming home to yourself. One final thing. In your healing and recovery process, it's important to uncover issues such as how the abuser came into your life, why you stayed, and the tactics the abuser employed. This is going to help you in your healing process as well as minimize the chances of another abuser making their way into your life.
Mm.
Transitioning from toxicity is important, and it's a process, and it's something that we all can get out of. We just got to start acknowledging it, noticing the red flags, and get out of there. Make the shift, make the change what's within so that you can ultimately change what's around.
I like that because, the fact is, I've often heard from people, for example, honor your father and your mother. And you're absolutely right. But the Bible also has prohibitions against parents abusing their children, right?
Yes,
And so,
correct.
and I think that's one of the hardest relationships to get out of, that which is when it's unhealthy. And I think we've got to do more talking about that because I think we're locked in on a lot of things that are just very, very, very unhealthy from the people who are closest to you.
That's it. Sometimes we don't know how to make that separation.
No, not at all. But it's something that's got to change. And I thank you for that because we're going to have to talk about that, I think, more extensively because we don't, we don't make that distinction. And I think that is a very dangerous thing because that toxicity, what is it? Dr. Harville Hendricks talks about the fact that we're all trying to heal from our relationships of origin, which are the relationships with our parents and
That's
whoever are,
Yes.
the formative people in your life. And so you spend the rest of your life in, you know, relationships, whether they're romantic or platonic, trying to heal that. We need to talk about that more extensively one day. I really
Let's do it. I'm excited to have that conversation.
Yeah, I know you are. I mean, because I think that's something that many of us don't want to talk about, and we have got to. We've got to. But sending you so much love. Are you going to be? When will you be preaching at New Covenant?
I'll be preaching here on the 4th Sunday and the 5th Sunday of this month at 9 a.m. New Covenant Baptist Church on the south side of Chicago.
Okay, I love it. I love it. I love it. And of course, at 3:00 on Friday, Facebook Live.
That's it.
All right. We just love you so much and so glad that you're with us. Let's pivot to Dr. Shanina Knighton. What is on your mind today? Infection prevention. Oh boy, when I talk to people, I think I'm making them a little paranoid, but that's all right. I don't mind. How are you doing?
But I'm good, and that's for sure, Santita, because the one thing that I will tell you that I am continuing to hear, and I just want to remind people, COVID has not gone anywhere. It has not left. And unfortunately, I find it very perplexing, even within the past couple weeks, couple days, I continue to hear I caught COVID from a party, and oh my gosh, it was so awful, it was so awful, it was so awful. And the reality is that just because the CDC is no longer tracking it, just because it is no longer on the radar of public funding, does not mean that it is not still wreaking havoc in communities. It still doesn't mean that it's having long-term consequences, which we already know. And as a result of that, that means that we should think back to how we should be staying vigilant with our practices as well as with our precautions.
I love that in you because, it's still here. And other things are still here. We're trying to tell folks this stuff is still here. It's still with us. We love you, Dr. Knight, and thank you for that. And, I think maybe tomorrow we need to go back over the precautions we need to take, particularly in the summer months, right? Because we're indoors, and when we're indoors, we're in closed spaces because we want the air conditioner on, right? We're outside. How do we navigate this new reality where now COVID is endemic? It's just now part of our life from day to day. Dr. Shanina Knighton, everybody. Hey, Dr. Nina, Heydrnina. Let's talk about how Republicans are now pushing back on your voting rights. No one is really looking at this. The corporate media on the so-called left and the so-called right, they really want to open everybody. They have you looking at Trump. Who's going to stand up to him? Will DeSantis stand up to him? Will Chris Christie stand up to him? Come on, he's just a human being. Get out of here. In the meantime, right, left, in between, and outside the lines, you do not have a guarantee on your voting rights. Oh, yeah, everybody looks at black people. That's right, because we're the canaries in the mine. But guess what? If I don't have my right to vote, you don't either. And voter suppression tactic is called the Big Lie Bill. That's right, the Big Lie Bill. It is poised to pass in the U.S. House of Representatives and in state legislatures all over the country. Let's talk about that. And then John Nichols wants to talk about the NATO summit. Sweden is about to be admitted to NATO. What is that going to mean? Well, if Sweden gets attacked, that means everybody's got to jump in. If Ukraine gets in, that means, NATO, they have the agreement that if one of them gets hurt, then everybody's got to join in on the fight. Let's talk about it on the Santita Braxton Show. Thank you so much, Dr. Knighton. Hello?
That's what I'm saying. You're welcome. Yeah, I was talking on mute. Oh, but I was saying, absolutely. It is. It's a sad reality, but I don't think people are paying attention to the fact that literally really are the side effects of COVID are still around, and unfortunately, as I mentioned, people get having access to resources is so important because it's not until afterwards where people are going through the long-term that they realize that they should have did more.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I just, I wonder where we are with all of this because there is so much. I think people, it's just like anything else. The problems after Hurricane Katrina did not go away, right? But people get fatigue, and then they don't want to hear about it anymore. And it's unfortunate, but heaven knows it's true. And it's like, but the problems are still here. The problems are still here. And no one really wants to talk about that.
I agree. And the thing the reality of it is that we have to, because when we have unexpected deaths that lead to children being without their parents, when we have parents that are now without their children as a result of COVID, it then becomes the reality that it has to be a conversation that we're having because we're thinking about how many displaced thought of it.
Well, I'm wondering, and now they are now pushing. I'm wondering how the conversation is going to change because now, there was a ruling last week that's going to allow more information about the vaccines and things like that to get out. And I think that's a good thing, because people need to be able to talk about different remedies and things like that. And
that, but also just really just talking about overall health.
mm-hmm.
Because the reality is when we can talk about the fact that getting our body in its most optimal position to be able to interact, with bacteria, viruses, and fungus is important, because even if it's not COVID, it's going to be something else. And our body has to be in the best optimal position to know that it can encounter it or handle it.
Well, I wonder just how ready we are to deal with all of that. I wonder.
Yeah.
I wonder.
University of Chicago. We have a little less than a minute. So far, I have Miss Wells on. I have
the reality of it is.
Hold on, Mr.
Attorney
McKee.
Patillo, and I have C.K. Hoffler. I'll be calling Mr. McKee and Reverend Wilson as soon as we go live.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Very welcome. For 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Robert. Hey, CK.
Hello.
How are you?
Great. Stand by, everybody, please.
10 seconds.
Chaparral.
Stand by.
Hey, honey, we're coming right to you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm ready.
Change the world, change the world. We can change the world, we can change the world, change the world.
This is the Santita Jackson Show.
War and hate to a place of love, it's not too late. Gotta save the children, we can't wait. Let's change the world. I am green.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show. Let's talk about voter suppression. It's not a sexy topic, if you will, but guess what? There's an analysis by Mother Jones magazine that shows that there was a staggering rise in voter suppression after the GOP imposed restrictions in Georgia. And now they're taking this nationwide. There's something called the Big Lie Bill, the American Confidence in Elections Act. That's right. What does that mean? Why are we not hearing about it? We need to hear about it. We need to know about it. And we need an executive order on voting rights so that we can be protected from it and vote. If the Democrats and if progressives are serious about winning, it's not progressives as much, it's the Democratic Party. We need to hear about this. And we need to be fighting this bill because it could pass the U.S. House of Representatives, which would be devastating. But it's also on track to, we're going to see it iterated or reiterated in state legislatures all across the country. I can't help but think about the Southern Crusade. And when we're at the Rainbow Push International Conference this weekend, the 15th through the 19th, it really begins on the 14th, where you're going to have a reunion of 40 years of people who were registering people to vote. And I want you to come too, because it's not just the people who were in the campaign. I want you to hear about the campaign. I want you to hear how it evolved in real time. We found that Americans had to register twice in these southern counties, in southern states, in order to register once. You had to register once in your county seat, and once in your local seat. Then you had to go to the county seat. That was something that was uncovered by the Jackson campaigns, and the Democratic Party supported it. So it was the Rainbow that fought that, for example. So we have a lot to talk about and a lot of work to do. We're going to be talking with John Nichols in the next hour, of course, about Ukraine and Sweden going into NATO and the cluster bombs. And there's just so much that John Nichols wants to get into. And congratulations to him and Bernie Sanders on their New York Times best-selling book. It's okay to be mad about capitalism. But let's talk with attorney Robert Patillo and attorney C.K. Hoffler about this ACE bill, the Big Lie Bill, the American Confidence in Elections Act. Boy, these folks never stop. But let me start with you, Chaparral Wells, getting these vittles together. You got to give me some greens and cabbage with ham hocks for my birthday. That's what I want.
Absolutely. You know, I'll definitely bring it to you this weekend because I'm actually making greens today.
Thank you.
So we're around picking cases of greens. But anyway, so give us a call at 708-526-4546. 708-526-4546. We're also setting up your college trunk party where we are doing the decor as well as also our sweet tables. So call us at 708-526-4546. 708-526-4546. We look forward to serving you, and thank you so much, Santita.
Thank you very much. Well, let's get this party started, and let's get it started quickly. Let me talk to you, Attorney Robert Patel. Why don't you set the table for us? What is this? Because I know you deal with this, you and Attorney C.K. Hoffler. Attorney C.K. Hoffler will be on WAOK today at 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. You don't want to miss her show. It's fantastic. And, of course, she's on Court TV. And when will you be on Court TV this week, Attorney Hoffler?
New caller.
Court TV on Thursday at 10 a.m.
Thursday at okay, all right, and and whatever else they call you, because there's just so much going on right now. But you know what? Before we get things started, let me you say I've got a caller, Alex. So let's Mama D, what's on your mind?
Well, your greetings to you. Regarding voter suppression, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is limited to 3 groups: Asians, Latinos, and Native Americans, because Congress said they are the most voter suppressed. Now, as members in a limited minority language group, I'm wondering why aren't any of those groups out there leading the effort to talk about this issue? Because it used to be no discrimination based on race, creed, or color. Mm-hmm. Now it's no discrimination based on race, color, and membership in this limited minority language group. Why isn't anybody talking about that?
We should talk about it. But you know what, Mama D, when you go to different parts of the country, you see different kinds and different levels of activism. I hope that you'll be with us this weekend at the Rainbow Bush International Conference, because one of the things that was really striking to us, I'm hearing some background noise, so if you could mute that for me, Alex. One of the things that was striking to us when we got to California, the people who were running our campaign, because many Black people ran away from Reverend Jackson in 1983 and 1984. I can tell you some folks, and they actively worked against his candidacy. But the AAPI community, and then when we got to Oklahoma, the indigenous communities, we get to New Mexico, the indigenous communities, they were running our campaign because they saw, they said, no, we need this. When we got to San Francisco at the Democratic Convention, the Asian community opened. I mean, our money was no good in Chinatown. Just so it depends upon where you are. That's why when people criticize politicians who are from California, for example, the politics in California are very different than they are in Chicago, than they are in Atlanta, Jackson, Mississippi, because you have different populations. When you get to Oklahoma, you see the indigenous community asserting their power because that's where they are. And so I think, to be fair, we don't see their level of activism in Chicago, but that doesn't mean that it's not there in other places. So, but, I'm with Congressman Jonathan Jackson, who says that, and Dr. Mark Lamont Hill and others who say, look, Black people in particular have been targeted for voter suppression. And so when you have a group that's been targeted specifically, you need to target that group specifically for protection and remedy. So that's real too. So we've got a lot to talk about. And people, Black folks speak more than one language. Just so not that you don't know that, Mama D, but we've got a lot of Black immigrants and migrants who, when they go to vote, you're supposed to be able to have someone go into the voting booth with you to help you to understand the other language. But in order to be a citizen,
and pass that citizenship
mm-hmm.
test, if you're not born in America, you're supposed to read, write, and speak
I hear you, but you know
not
what?
a citizen, you shouldn't be voting.
Well, the only thing I would have to say to you to be careful about that, Mama D, and I'm going to pivot to Robert Patillo. Many of us, it has been demonstrated that many Americans cannot pass the citizenship test. That's why we have to push for.
But that's not the point.
No.
Says who.
Mama D, just one moment. Many of us could not pass. I know the Constitution has said a lot of things, but we have to amend it to make it real. Many of us could not pass this citizenship test. No, I mean, it's just, many of us can't pass the citizenship test. So we got to be very careful. Many of us are pushing back on migrants.
No, we don't, because the 14th Amendment is very clear.
It's very clear.
To be a citizen, and only Native Americans and American Africans could be born in America and not be citizens in the land of their birth until the 14th Amendment.
And you do note
that 14th Amendment is important.
And you do note that the Constitution had to be amended to include us, particularly at first with the indigenous
and Native Americans.
And we're still working on it, Mama D.
Genocidal Holocaust.
Mama D, and we're still working on it. And I'm just saying it still requires a lot of work. And part of it is educating. Just one moment. Educating the American.
I've read the John Lewis.
I have read it. I have read it many times.
Please, don't just admit what Congress has said. They said that these three groups were the most voter suppressed.
No, no, that's part of it. But I'm going to let Robert Patillo and C.K. Hoffler and this group speak to you on that. Because, yes, please do. Because the fact is, all of these laws, Mama D, as we amend them, as we work on the more perfect union, they're supposed to protect everybody. And I'm the first to admit, and I resist any attack. No one has stood more vigilantly and on guard for Black people. But I'm very clear, Black people are not the only people who are being hurt here. That is part of when you're talking to white people, they don't even understand how much they have been injured. The whole idea of America was not to include all people, including and especially white folks. The monarchs and the oligarchs had a fight. The oligarchs won, and they're winning today. We need to get real about that. Robert Patillo, why don't you first speak to what Mama D said, and then let's talk about this ACE bill.
Caller's off.
Well, thank you so much, Santita. And it's an important point that you're making about the anti-monarchist. Because if you notice, if you go back through 250 years of European history, anytime someone tried to stand up to the monarchical powers, they used every coalition possible. They used every piece of media and history possible to paint them as being the enemy to history. Napoleon stood up against monarchies. The fear for the Europeans was that his revolution would spread to the other monarchical states. This is why they're making a movie about him. This is why they had 200 years of propaganda that he was short, that he was crazy, that all these things, because he wanted to overturn the monarchies of Europe. If you look at the communist revolution, the reason that Americans hate communism today is that the communist revolution threw over Tsar Nicholas, who was the cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm, who was the cousin of the King of England at the time during World War I. And the fear was that the communist revolution would overturn monarchies across Europe and across the developed world. So the reason the Americans have a negative impression of communism is because they acted as being an anti-monarchical force. And when you're looking at this ACE Act, I mean these other voter suppression laws, they're being based off of laws that came out of the laboratories of democracy, places like Georgia. This is based very much on Senate Bill 202. That we fought tooth and nail here in Georgia a couple years ago. But one of the problems is that national Democrats don't get involved on local legislation until it's too late. The same thing as what was Stand Your Ground a decade and a half ago, where they were passing these laws in 2006, and people didn't find out about them until Trayvon was killed in 2011, 2012. Democrats very much have done a bad job of focusing in on these quote-unquote election protection measures that states have been passing, which weren't actually meant to protect anybody, but it was great branding. These bills also deal with curtailing quote-unquote illegal immigrant voting. Now, there is no actual proof of illegal immigrant voting, However, by saying that you're protecting against it, that allows you to challenge any person who looks like they might not be American, i.e. racially profiled individual who look Hispanic, to challenge them to see where's your papers law that they're pushing forward. Additionally, it increases the amount of outside money. This goes into that monarchical part that the billionaire and billionaire classes can pump into these elections for quote unquote election protection, including outside monitors who are able to report anybody that they believe are interfering with elections or that whose ballot to be challenged. That allows individuals to question entire precincts. It really is a level of separation between the individualized vote and the outcome of elections that undermines the entire concept of democracy. President Trump has a good history of laying out exactly what they're doing. He doesn't do the hidden ball trick. He tells you what they're doing, and then they do it. He said about a year before the election, it doesn't matter who votes. It matters who counts the votes, and that's what these ACE acts are intended to do. It more than likely won't pass the U.S. Congress because there's a Democratic Senate and Democratic president, but we will see these bills take place state by state, and these bills are so atrocious that we've seen the Tory party in Great Britain start taking these things on. And in the local elections, they're starting to use voter ID. They're starting to use voter suppression tactics because they want to push back against migrants voting the same way that white people in America want to push back on black people and immigrants voting. So if our voter suppression is good enough to be exported to Europe and to neo-fascists there, we need to fight back against it here.
Attorney C.K. Hoffler, do we need an executive order on voting rights? Because as Robert Patilla pointed out, may or may not pass in Washington, but it is being iterated and reiterated state by state. The Republicans have a state by state strategy, and it has been working, Attorney Hoffler.
Well, of course we need an executive order, Santita. Good morning, everyone, because, we have to go back to Shelby County versus Holder, which got rid of the pre-clearances and important pre-clearances against discrimination in the voting process. We have to remember there was a time when black folks, minority folks, women could not vote. There was a time in, unfortunately, my lifetime when we couldn't vote without the violence and without fear of being killed, and many were killed. So there were pre-clearances that were put in place, but the Shelby County versus Holder case, 2013, seminal case, got rid of some of the protections and put it to the states. So now the states are able to do whatever they want to do in terms of running elections. Now, why do we need federal, an executive order? We need an executive order to counter just these types of moves with ACE legislation. See, I don't put it past anyone to slide this through, because the politics as we see it, the way the country is going right now, a lot of things that we never thought would happen are happening, such as the U.S. Supreme Court getting rid of affirmative action, such as the U.S. Supreme Court repealing Roe versus Wade, such as the U.S. Supreme Court taking other actions, which I feel are setting back the hand of time. So I think we do need federal executive orders by President Biden, because if we cannot pass a voting rights act, no matter what you call it, right now in the United States Congress, for whatever reason, I don't support that because I think it could happen. But if it can't, then when we have a Democratic president, we have an executive order that guarantees as much as possible these rights. Because if not, the voter suppression is going to be severe. Let me tell you, I live in Georgia. I voted in Georgia. And we on this show have talked about how narrowly Senator Raphael Warnock won his runoff election against Herschel Walker. He just beat him by a little bit. And that was because of the machinery, the Republican machinery that was in place, but also because of the voter suppression. That this ACE bill is modeled after a Georgia law that is exceptionally suppressive in terms of people's right to vote. And you don't know until you're there. So when there are requirements that you come up and you have to show this type of identification, you have to do this. There are young black children, and I'm pointing to what Mamadi was saying, who are trying to vote that were having problems. There were lines circled around Morehouse, where people couldn't, and in African American communities here in Georgia, where there were all kinds of irregularities because of this, because that could be and was sanctioned by this Georgia voter suppressive law. So if it becomes, and we have to watch this movement to make it a federal law, it is going to make it more difficult than it is for black and to vote. I know because I saw it here in Georgia. So we need the protections. The president needs to put in place an executive order to counter this because we know this is where they're headed. It took many, many years for people who were affirmative action to get rid of affirmative action. And they did it because they were relentless, because they were tenacious, because whenever they could, they had a plan, a master plan to put in place U.S. Supreme Court justices, and they did it. So this is coming. We know it's coming. So we have to fight it.
And Democrats they know it's coming and they have to act like it's coming, Dwight, but they don't. I mean, there's no pushback. I have to read in Common Dreams, which I read it every day throughout the day because they're constantly refreshing. And they give us, and fairness and accuracy in reporting, they give us wonderful reporting, Mother Jones and The Nation and on and on. I mean, because I'm trying to find the information. They're running on how am I going to get Trump and trying to fight. I'm not frightened of Trump. Look, I'm a person who is descended from slavery in the United States. The most horrific things that could happen to a human being happened in my family and yours. So you can't frighten me anymore. That's the good side of that. My eyes don't cry, and I can't be afeared of nothing. So Dwight McKee, talk to us. I mean, we're looking at the corporate media have us looking at Donald Trump. Because I approached you the other night about talking about Donald Trump, but then we had to look at Tulsa yesterday, which Turning Hoffler, we're going to be looking at that again tomorrow. I want to reach out to Reverend Dr. Turner and hope that you all will join us there because he has looked at Sinclair Gas, and he said, no, they hired the pilots and they hired the planes that dropped the bombs on Tulsa. So we got to talk about that tomorrow because they can be sued today and they can be boycotted today. But now, I mean, the corporate media, everybody's talking about Trump, but no one's talking about this, about protecting our vote. Dwight McKee.
Well, first you have to understand that the United States didn't start off as 50 states. It started out as 13 states. And every few years, new territories would come in and petition to become states. And when petition to become states, they'd have to negotiate with the federal government on what terms they would become states. And each of these territories negotiated it based on their own interests, the interest of those who were in charge, the interest of those who owned the land, the interest of those who were trying to maintain power. And so that negotiation varied from state to state. It also changed from year to year.
Well, hold on one moment. Hold on, because you make a point that I don't want it to be lost on me or anyone else. So do you think that is why states' rights are something that that people hold on to so tightly, Dwight?
And they're transitory.
Okay.
They are not permanent. It's per negotiation, per what time in history the negotiation took place. And so as the demographic state changes, the dynamics changes, those negotiations change. And so those laws then usually happens at a local level. And without the intervention of the federal government, they become the laws of that state. And so we tend to think that because these temporary negotiations have worked at some point in history, they are now permanent solutions to problems.
And so, because we got the Voter Rights Act, for example, with Dr. King back in the 60s, for some reason we thought that was both universal and permanent. Not understanding that bad boy could change at any step of the way, which is why politics is something you have to be ever vigilant in. You can't get a victory and think that victory is going to stand forever over the years everywhere.
No, say that one more time. Say that one more, because Laura Bell is sending you much love. A whole lot of folks say, what did you just say? Right.
Let me try that one more time.
1 minute.
One more time. We think that because we have a temporary victory at a local level, that somehow that's universal and permanent. And we live as if this victory is now the law of the land. It may be the law of the land in that territory for that day, but each one of those territories are going to renegotiate as their demographics change for how it's going to operate in that particular locality. And unless the federal government imposes its will, that is going to be the law of that territory at that point in time. And it's going to change year by year, week by week, month by month, year by year. And so if we're not ever vigilant, then we may win the win, but then we get caught swept up in the whirlwind. And so it's very easy for affirmative action to become affirmative reaction. It's very easy for the realities that we're operating in to change.
Because they do.
As a demographic thing.
Because they do. Things change. They really do. America today does not look the way it looked 400 years ago. It wasn't even America 400 years ago.
It don't look like it looked 20 years ago. It looked like it looked 20 years ago.
And the migrants, we were the migrants. Yeah. After the Civil War, we still did not have citizenship. Back with more of the Santita Jackson Show in just a minute. July 15th to the 19th, really the 14th to the 19th, Rainbow Push International Conference. We are having a reunion. And I want you, whether you participated in the Jackson campaign or not, to be part of it. You need to talk to people who are involved in it, learn from them, and let us move on together. Back with more of the Santita Jackson Show in just a minute. Dwight, you make some great points. Thank you. You and CK and Robert Patillo. I'm sorry, I'm looking over here. Let me pull this up. But keep talking, because we're on Facebook Live.
But I wanted to know if Daddy Dude was rhyming. I thought I heard him rhyming this morning.
Probably. Raymond, like you do, CK.
I rhyme? Okay. I don't even realize it.
But no one has seen you do your rapper's delight.
Well, yeah, but that's when I'm doing something else. But, so Peter, this is what I believe increasingly, based on the space. What they said was, first of all, we wasn't right-handed. We almost won. That he was about as bad as we can get, and we almost won. So what we did in Georgia was actually a good thing that we need to replicate. So let's replicate that, because we almost
Attorney Fancher's on.
had we had a halfway a candidate who could just hold his own a little bit on any level, we would have won. So that is what I believe why it is a statute that mirrors the Georgia voter suppressive law. That's what I believe. Because they said Georgia was if we had just not had, if Herschel had just shut his mouth a little bit more, we would have won.
CK, do you remember Dan Quayle?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let us not have had high intelligence as the bar for election to office.
No, high intelligence, I'm okay with a little bit of intelligence, I'm not okay with it, but I recognize that is not the barometer. But I think that Herschel Walker had so many issues. And I mean, we had a member of Congress who lied about who he was, his name and all that kind of stuff, got elected, and he's still there. But
But I recognize that the bar is very low. The bar shouldn't be low.
It shouldn't be.
But in a real sense, it shouldn't be. If we wonder why would they choose Georgia to replicate? Why would they replicate? The reason why is because it's working in Georgia. And they almost had, it's an inconceivable notion based on how people perceive what's going on here in Georgia. That Senator Raphael Warnock almost lost. I mean, it really is.
It's
Abrams.
It's just not shocking. When we I think that's why we have to explain to people just how far down the rabbit hole goes. Because intelligence, not even high intelligence, is not the bar. Even the games that we play on who's acceptable for higher office and who's not acceptable. That's why I've tried to tell people, hey, when you get elected to the state or federal office, you owe the Democratic or Republican Party money. You come in with a bill. You get a call as soon as you get into that office as a U.S. representative or a U.S. senator, and the Democrats call you and say, okay, now you got to raise, in addition to the money you got to raise for you must start by giving me $150,000, $200,000 today. Got to come up with it. People need to understand how politics is played. That's why Dwight making the point. Hey, you made the point. No. We need the executive order on voting rights. Dwight making the point. Y'all, do you all not understand that it's been about states' rights? That's why there was a fight by John Adams and others. Okay, well now let's solidify the federal government, because if we don't, you're gonna have 13 and 20 odd and then 50 rights. I mean, I don't think, whenever I can see any of these reenactments of our origins as a nation, I watch them because it humanizes the founding fathers and mothers, and it humanizes the struggles, and you get a chance to hear them philosophically work things out. And you see how they push slavery aside, because many of them had slaves or saw slaves or enslaved people, and they said, well, we need them to keep this going. So now that we have some workers who we don't have to pay, let's deal with this issue. It has always been thus. Mark Fancher, how you doing?
I'm fine. Good morning.
Oh, you know what? I did not know about Joanne Watson.
Oh, yeah. For me, it was very sudden. I heard that she had been ill for a little bit, but it happened just yesterday afternoon. So
I am so, she used to do my show when I was at the Word Network.
Oh, yeah, I do.
Boy.
And
that broke my
she
heart.
meant a lot to
everybody.
Yeah, she meant a lot to Michigan. So
well, to all of us, the people who don't even know.
There's no conversation.
No, I mean, I had to stop. I said, wait, really? Are you sure? Now, I had to go Google. I said, well, maybe it wasn't her. You start hoping that, okay, maybe I'm misremembering. Maybe I don't have this right. And man, I mean, because she was only 72, and everybody, she was a powerhouse. Can you say something about her on the air here? Because even though many people don't know her, many people do, and people need to know who Joanne Watson was. She headed up the NAACP in Michigan, CK and Robert and Dwight, but she was on the city council, and she was just a powerhouse in politics there, and really an inspiration for all of us. Such a lady and such a woman, and I just thank God for her. And now she was only 72. I only 72. I can't.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize you said this.
Just yesterday, I saw Mark's note, and I had to
30 seconds.
Thank you. I had to resist I had to resist the urge to call you, Mark, because I was like, wait a minute, are you sure? I just I just didn't want to believe that was so.
Mark, are you in Michigan? I'm sorry, Mark, are you in Michigan?
Okay. Yeah.
Stand by, everybody.
10 seconds. Stand by.
We can change the world, change the world, change the world. We can change the world, we can change the world, change the world.
This is the Santita Jackson Show.
War and hate to a place of love, it's not too late. Gotta save the children, we can.
Yeah, even though Raphael Warnock won, it was still a struggle, and it should not have been. It should not have been. So we got to talk about that, everybody. We got to derate, not a bad storm, just a bad connection, but it's all right. So please let me know if you can hear. Okay, let me know if you've got the sound and all of that. So let's talk about why we need to meet and why we need to be together starting on the 14th. But I want you to call me now about voter suppression. There is a bill that's been put forth in Congress, but we're seeing different forms of this bill being put forth in legislatures all across the country, and it's winning. Everybody, we're losing, but it's winning. The corporate media are making you look at Trump, and they're not helping you to see what is really going on, and you're being denied the right to vote. And of course, Dwight McKee has helped us to understand the history of that, as has Robert Patillo, as has Attorney C.K. Hoffler. We're joined by Attorney Mark Fancher, and I'm so glad that he's with us today. Let's get to some of these headlines so we can get through this show. We're going to have John Nichols, of course, at the bottom of the hour, talking about NATO, of course. NATO leaders are meeting today at a key summit in Lithuania as Russia's war in Ukraine remains a top agenda item, along with discussing a future pathway for the war-torn country to join the alliance. Will they admit Sweden? Well, word is that they will. What about Ukraine? Well, President Biden has said, hold on, we got to win the war in Russia first. We'll see what's going to come out of this NATO summit, everybody. More than 3 million people are under flood alerts across the Northeast today after multiple rounds of intense storms forced water rescues and evacuations across the region. Parts of New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine are expecting more showers today. Twitter's traffic tanked following the launch of Meta's rival app, Threads, which topped more than 100 million users within 5 days after it launched, according to Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg. You will be part of Threads, everybody. Let me know. I think I'm going to have to join because I guess that's part of it. In Chicago, we're going to have a high of 83 degrees, partly cloudy. Minneapolis, St. Paul, 79 degrees and clear. In Major League Baseball, it's the All-Star game tonight, everybody. Will the National League, will the underdogs, will they triumph? Or will they be triumphant over the American League? We will see. Home Run Derby did not disappoint. First time in history that a father and Home Run Derby champions. Congratulations to you, everybody. It's being held out there in Seattle, and they are having a great there in the WNBA. Chicago and Minneapolis will have the night off, I guess, because everybody's going to be watching the game tonight. And tomorrow, soccer will resume as well. Go All-Star game. Everybody, you know, as we pivot to the rest of this topic about our voting rights, many people are concerned about our money and holding on to our homes. More and more Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Indeed, more and more Americans who have six-figure incomes are living paycheck to paycheck, not because they've overspent, but because their money just doesn't extend as far. So we have been working with Team Hochberg, and we're going to get David Hochberg back on here very, very soon so you can find out what you need to do if you are on the verge of foreclosure. You need to find out what you need to do to how you speak to the bank. Maybe they can negotiate with the bank for you. Don't know, but I tell you what, there is a program for first-time home buyers that they are really working on, and it could be golden for you. It could be an opportunity. If you've not owned a home within the past 3 years, that means that you are a first-time home buyer. I don't care when you might have owned a home in the past. If you have not owned a home in the past 3 years, you're a first-time home buyer. And so Team Hochberg, your trusted local lender, wants to help you to own a home. Last year, only 26% of home buyers bought, they were first-time home buyers. Only 26%. That's down from 34% the year before, and the numbers continue to fall. What does that mean? That means more and more Americans are not investing in home ownership. What the consequences are really, they're quite substantial. They're quite substantial. That means our wealth is diminishing. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac decided to turn those numbers around by encouraging first-time home buyers, people who have not owned homes in the past 3 years. So if you live in the Chicago area and your income, the total household income is below $105,700, and you've not owned a home within the past 3 years, Team Hochberg can help you out. Call them at 855-56-DAVID, 855-56-DAVID, or go to 56david.com and talk to somebody like calling folks and find out what you can do to become a homeowner. You might see an apartment building down the street. Might be a house that you've been eyeing that you think is beyond your reach. No. Need to call some people who know. Let us talk about the vote. This big lie bill is very, very real, and the American Confidence in Elections Act, while that's in the U.S. House of Representatives, Attorney Robert Patillo, Dwight McKee, Attorney C.K. Hoffler, and now Attorney Mark Fancher, we're seeing the spirit of it, and we're seeing these kinds of laws pushed and passed in state legislatures all across the country. It's going to be very difficult, more and more difficult, for people to vote. White, black, yellow, and red. Okay, remember at the founding of the Republic, the idea was not for everybody to vote, including white people, only property white males. So you got to think about that, everybody. Let me start with you, Attorney Mark Fancher. Before you do begin, we lost a woman who has been an icon for those people who live in Detroit, but really she's been a leading light for those of us who've been involved in activism all across the country. Joanne Watson, Reverend Joanne Watson, who had been a civic leader, council in Detroit, head of the NAACP in Michigan. She just has been a powerhouse in transition yesterday. Just 72.
Yes, she did, and it's a shock to all of us. I think for anybody who has heard me on this show more than a few times, they're well aware of the fact that I detest politicians. I'm sorry, I make no apologies. I don't like them. But she served on the city council for 10 years. And I used to tell her I didn't like politicians, and I'd make politician jokes in front of her. But I always hastened to say, I'm not talking about you, because you're not a politician, even though you say you are. I said that what you are is a revolutionary freedom fighter who the people put into office. And she really was. Unlike a politician who makes calculated decisions about what they're going to say or what they're going to do and tries to maneuver and play the political game, she never did. She stood firm on principles. Whatever was right, she did it, no matter what the consequences. The decisions that she made, the positions that she took, were the product of prayers, heartfelt discussions that she had. And she plunged right into the fray, not afraid at all of what the consequences might be. And her service on so many fronts is just incredible. She played leadership roles in the reparations movement, specifically with the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. She was on John Conyers' staff. She had a radio show that ran for years called Wake Up Detroit, which was she was committed to do. And most important to me was her spiritual connection. I was absolutely convinced that she had a direct pipeline to God when, after she was first elected to the city council back in about 2003, I was sitting at my desk in a small nonprofit law organization that I worked for at the time and looking at the bills that I had to pay for daycare and other things, and just thinking, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And the phone rang, and she said, "Hello, Mark Fancher. This is Joanne Watson. I just got elected, as you know, and you just have that new baby, and you need to come work for me to make some money to make ends meet." And I said, "Lord have mercy." And so I worked part-time for her to supplement my income, and saw firsthand how she operated and her total, absolute commitment to the people. And last thing I'll say about her, because she was prophetic. Most cities have a Chinatown. In Detroit, they also have they have Mexican Town. What she wanted was an economic empowerment zone called Africa Town, not only for economic empowerment, but to preserve African culture. And when she put that on the table at City Council, all of the forces of power came at her with all guns blazing, because this was not part of the plan that they had for the gentrification of Detroit. And she fought. And it's just an incredible loss that we have. But at the same time, I'm celebrating because I know she's in the arms of God right now, straight to heaven, no problems.
And she showed us what, when the people run you for office, not when you run yourself, what can happen there. There's a sense of protection. And that's what we have to start. It's not about the money. It shouldn't be. But we need to understand that we need to start lifting up people and run them for office and do whatever we can to keep them there. And I just love you, Reverend Joanne Watson, and I thank God that you are now in the arms of God. No more crying, no more worrying. Thank God for you, Joanne Watson. Talk to me, Mark Fancher. What about these laws that are pushing back on our voting rights? I mean, they're bold, but everybody's talking about Trump. The corporate media, that's all they want to talk about.
And they really should be talking more about major corporations, because at least the feature, significant feature of the main one involves the capacity or the ability of corporations to make even larger contributions to campaigns and to be less transparent. And, this system has always been one that the corporate controlled and have dominated. I frequently said that we have one party with two names. They really don't care which one wins, as long as they're able to control whatever the winner says or does. And so this enhances their ability to do that. And I think if we understand and acknowledge that this is in many ways a rigged system, and that these are not laws that are intended to derail it or to make it something other than it is, but it is intended to increase the capacity and the power that the corporations already have. And it, for me, underscores the importance of, certainly not short term. I mean, it's not anything that we can accomplish, but long term, we certainly have to, especially as members of oppressed communities, particularly communities of color, figure out an alternative political reality for ourselves. We have to be able to function independent of this rigged political system in a way that ensures that our communities are taken care of, that the basic needs are met, and that we have the opportunity to continue to rise, and for those of us who seek total liberation to achieve that. But we're not going to get it hoping and expecting that somehow we're going to reform the political system and the political process. I mean, we should continue to try and ensure voting rights and all of those things to make the best of this as we can. But we can't look to that as the source of our salvation. It simply was not designed to do that. And we've got to really become more conscious of our duty to come up with an alternative political agenda and an alternative political approach.
Well, I agree. I mean, Attorney Patillo, but at the top of the news this morning, it's NATO. No, I mean, and you can get through an hour's worth of programming, I intentionally use that word, in the news, and you're not going to hear about the pushback on voting rights for Americans while we're talking about delivering democracy to Ukraine. Robert Patillo, help me with that.
Well, a big part of that is because it's not something that we demand as Americans. As Americans, we are fine with propaganda. We are completely A-OK with being fed the same dog feed that we always get, because we're an curious nation when it comes to news, and particularly in Black media. Any of us who have been in the field for a while will understand that they will feed us some gossip and some celebrity dramas and celebrity news in a second. Everybody knows what's going on with Keke Palmer and her outfit and the Usher concert and her boyfriend. Very few people know what's going on with voter suppression, and that is intended. There's a reason that the number of newspapers in America has declined. There's a reason there's so much government and corporate censorship in social media. Social media to show you a bunch of mess and not to show you news. There's a reason that we've seen the consolidation of local news around the country, where you can have companies like Sinclair and others that send a script out to every single news station in the country dang near and have them reading from the same piece of music. Americans have to become more curious when it comes to understanding exactly what happens in our federal government, and particularly the laws that are being pushed through, not just on the federal level, but in the state houses around the country. The laboratories of democracy as it would be. And right there, they're the international laboratories for voter suppression. These ideas are being cooked up in the state houses in Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, etc. We're starting to see these things end up in Parliament in Great Britain. Mm-hmm. We're starting to see the French implement many of these aspects of police brutality and voter suppression that's being learned right here in America. We're seeing in Italy many of the anti-immigrant policies that we've been using for years in our southern border being used in the Mediterranean to fight back against African and Middle Eastern migrants that are coming forward. Remember, the Nazis learned how to abuse the Jews by looking at the Jim Crow South in America, by looking at the way that America treated African Americans, inspiration that they used for the Holocaust. So when we look at these laws that are being passed through these state houses, is more than simply a responsibility that we have to this nation to fight back against them. It's a responsibility we have as part of the civilized world to fight back against these neo-fascists and white supremacists who want to instill the same social system that has existed for hundreds of years in colonization, that they perfected here in America. They learn lynching. They learn racial intimidation. They learn how to build a clan and how to build Jim Crow laws, and then they export it around the globe. So the same thing that we see happening to us here, we'll see happening to Palestinians. The same thing that we'll see happening to us here in America as African Americans, we'll see the Chinese doing to the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang province. It is insidious nature that they have, but they try it here in America first because they understand we have the longest history of brutality against minority acceptance of white.
We have not. We need to become better students of history. We need to be much more attentive so we can really understand how we started, and which helps us understand what the fights are when we're here. Because we
well, and also it's important to know when we were fighting the old fight that's been going on forever. And Daddy D reminds us of that a lot.
Mr. Nichols is on, still on, is Attorney Patillo, C.K. Hoffler, and Mr. McKee.
How we honor our great statesmen. We don't call them Mr. We don't need to call them Doctor. We refer to them as our fathers.
That's true.
We refer to them as our uncles. And so when I say Daddy D, when I say Uncle D, Uncle Dwight, it's with a great deal of reverence. It's not just saying, like that. It's with a great deal of reverence, but it also is something that young folks can relate to Daddy D, too. They know that that's Big Daddy. So I just want to say.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess thank you, Steve.
But
I
just wanted to clarify.
Well, let me finish this. Let me finish this little point. I think our problem is that we think the temporary victory makes us citizens, and not understanding that may be true for that region at that time, but that's not inherently transferable because that's going to be dealt with at every level, in every state, for whatever interest you're dealing with. And so when a Frederick Douglass says that nothing, power never yields anything without a fight, that's a real premise that we have to internalize. He's talking about day by day, state by state, minute by minute, as the song says, goes, that nothing, no power yields without a fight. Everything you get, you have to fight for. You won't get everything you fight for, but everything you won't, everything you fight for, you won't get. But you certainly have to fight for all you need to get. And that's real, and that's every generation. That's, and once I keep
1 minute
that, then they will understand that citizenship is an evolving process. Citizenship is a war. It's not an event. It's a war. It's not an event.
Look, you get no pushback from me. John Nichols, magazine, New York Times, best-selling author. How you doing?
I'm well, and I'm delighted that we are
30 seconds.
listening to Dwight today.
Oh, and Robert Patillo. I mean, we'll all be together shortly. Can't believe Kevin Gray's not.
I know.
Here.
I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, yeah. You know what? Let's celebrate who's here.
Yeah.
But Frank Watkins.
Let us also celebrate Steve Cobble. But boy, we're lucky to have so many wise and strong people still with us.
Absolutely.
That is,
stand by.
Recognize that. And, I think there's going to be a perfect blend.
Stay right there.
Change the world, change the world. We can change the world, we can change the world, change the world.
This is the Santita Jackson Show.
War and hate to a place of love, it's not too late. Gotta save the children, we can't wait. Let's change the world. I agree.
Hey, everybody, you know what time it is. It's time. John Nichols of the Nation magazine, New York Times bestselling author. You got to get, with Bernie Sanders, whenever those two get together, there's got to be something, a whole lot of stuff going on. It's okay to be mad about capitalism. It's okay. It's okay. Get the book, everybody. They say it's okay. Don't be upset about it. You can be mad about it, and you can reform it too. So everybody, let's talk about. In fact, John Nichols, you've got Attorney C.K. Hoffler, the chair of the Rainbow Push Coalition, and Attorney Robert Patillo, Rainbow Push Coalition. They're both with WAOK. He's on Sundays from 1 to 4 Eastern time. I can hear something in the background, everybody. And C.K. will be on at 11 o'clock today on WAOK on her show, and on Thursday, Court TV. But watch Court TV throughout the week because she does a lot of analysis. Sometimes they just call her, and of course, Dwight McKee. Before I pivot to you, John Nichols, as we talk about as we talk about this, the convention, which because I met John at the beginning of really coming out of the Southern Crusade. Talk about people who were on the early bus. I mean, these are people who were with us all the way at the beginning. And John Nichols is one of those persons. And we're looking at Dwight McKee made a point about citizenship. And, really the dynamic nature of it. And Dwight McKee, in about a minute, could you make that point again? Because I think it's important. It leads into what John has been talking about. And just, if you can just even tell us why it's important for us to be at the convention. But first, you, Dwight.
Well, I was saying that citizenship is an evolving proposition. It's not an event that happens. All of a sudden you get a victory and now you have all the rights to citizenship. It evolves and it's dynamic. And so women had the right to abortions for about 20 years, maybe 40 years. And that bad boy flipped on them, and now they don't have the same right. That's a state-by-state right now. It's not a federal right. And each state makes that decision for itself. And that's true for everything in politics. So what's true today may not be true tomorrow, or may not be as true tomorrow. And what's not true today may be true tomorrow. And so we have to understand two things. One is the nature of the opposition and what their interest is. And then secondly, how does it impact our interest? And that's where the fight is, because they're fighting for their interests. And we have to fight for our own. And so we could never just put down the gauntlet and say this is over. This is the third round. This is a 15-round fight. This is just the third round. And you get judged round by round. And so that's the importance of understanding our ancestors, TK, as you was talking about, is that because all of them were fighting these same fights at different levels in different localities. And we have to use them as role models. Not just their fight, but the energy they put in their fights. Because again, in an evolving reality with evolving demographics, then all of everything that's on the table is going to evolve and going to change. The Chicago of 10 years ago is not the Chicago of today. 10 years ago, there was 200,000 more people in Chicago, black people in Chicago, than it is today. And there was probably 50,000 less Hispanic people in Chicago than it is today. And there's also a whole young class of white people who have gentrified a lot of the city today. So all of those politics are going to change, and all of those fights are going to change. And that's true for every city in this country. That's what we have to come to understand.
And John Nichols, which brings me to you today. I mean, because we're watching the political sands just shift in the United States. You know, at the NATO summit, now you see the NATO countries trying to figure out how to relate to Africa, how to relate to India, how to relate to the BRICS nations, because they're the people who were colonized. Now the people who were colonized are now on the ascendancy. Everything is changing, and that's why I think we have to be very open. And I think that was one of the lessons of the Jackson campaign, how important you are in the process, why you need to be the world that Reverend foresaw in 1983. He said, oh no, it's here. Trust me, it's here. And it's here. He said, not as of this day, that November 3rd, 1983, as of this day, nothing will be the same. Everything will change. And he said, when I win, you win. And we need to have more people running for office who want us all to win, not just someone who's going to secure victory for themselves. But as you come to Chicago and as we talk about these other politics, let me just ask you, why did you get involved in the Jackson campaign? You know, because it was outliers who joined in now.
Yeah, there's truth in that. Well, first off, what an honor to be with everybody today. And I will tell you that I think Dwight today is channeling the genius of A. Philip Randolph. When I was listening to Dwight just a moment ago, and it relates to all that we're talking about, I was remembering Randolph's great quote, and I hope I get it basically right. Justice is never given, it is exacted, and the struggle must be continuous, for freedom is never a final fact, but a continuing, evolving process to higher and higher levels of human, social, economic, political, and religious relationship. And that notion that it's never given, you have to struggle for it, it's never a final fact. You know, it's exactly what Dwight's saying here, and it's such an important thing to understand. We remember the struggles of the past so that we get strength and energy for the struggles of the present. And we keep kind of moving that, hoping for that evolution that takes us into a better future. And I remember back very, very clearly in 1983, and people should be conscious of that. I mean, younger folks especially, that was a tough. Reagan was president of the United States. He was transforming much of how government, diminishing it, but also on an international level. Remember the invasion of Grenada. You have all sorts of tensions all over the world. That was that fall. It was that time. And most of the Democrats in Congress were falling in line and were not really debating. There were a handful who were, by the way, and, Ted Weiss and some others who were great, Ron Dellums. But most members of Congress were very internally focused. They were maybe fighting Reagan on a few things, but they weren't looking at this international stage. We're still in the midst of the Cold War and everything. And then here comes the Reverend Jesse Jackson. And he is saying, we have incredible domestic struggles. Reagan's taken us in the wrong direction. We ought to be going toward economic and social and racial justice, not in the other direction. But he also never hesitated to bring in this global view, to bring in this perspective of what was happening around the world. He spoke regularly about Central America. So many people have forgotten the struggles that were going on in Central America at that time when the United States was literally supporting some of the darkest forces in that region. Talked about the Middle East, about Israel and Palestine at a time when almost no one in public life was talking about that region of the world and the struggles of the Palestinian people. And we spoke about South Africa. And you asked me what drew me in. And I have to tell you, a huge part of what drew me to the Reverend Jackson's campaign back in 1983 was his focus on apartheid and his willingness to bring it up and to talk about it in deep and fundamental ways. He wasn't the first. There were others who had spoken about apartheid, over the years. But at that level, politically, to have someone saying, no, this is absolutely wrong. The United States are on the wrong side. This is a very clear struggle. And Nelson Mandela should not be sitting on Robben Island, imprisoned for decades. These people, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu and others, ought to be freed. And as they are freed, they ought to be brought into a democratic system, small d democratic system, in which ultimately they would be in a position to govern and lead that country. It would take another decade. But Reverend Jackson would speak of that in those days. And I have to tell you, it was such an enlightening and exciting moment to have the struggle against apartheid spoken about in every town and in every city he went to. And I mean, I'll tell you, it was that was a beautiful struggle. It was a righteous struggle. And Reverend Jackson, I think, did tremendous work to advance it. He proved what you can do as a presidential candidate, that using that platform, that position as a presidential candidate, you can make other people discuss the issue, and you can build out a movement. You can give people confidence, even in small towns in rural Wisconsin, where I was from, to believe it is possible to stand on the right side of history.
But then the supporters like you went back home and then went around the country and led those discussions, because it wasn't just him, right? The leader, absolutely. But it was also you going home and you leading the discussion and bringing up, because remember, we had a no-talk policy with the Palestinians, and you did not mention them. You did not dare mention them in polite company and in public conversation. No. Reverend ended that. Mandela was a terrorist, even as president.
Oh, yeah,
of South Africa.
This was what was said.
It was codified in American law. So, I mean, we can make a difference. We can make a difference, and we can shift. We can change the tides. We can. I mean, and speaking of which, that's what we're seeing happen now. What is happening with now? Why are we? There are only a handful of countries. America finds itself in the company of Russia, Iran, North Korea. These are our avowed enemies. And what we say now, we're all going to use cluster bombs. Now, if we're going to have moral authority, how can we use cluster bombs, which last, Robert Pacillo, we've been talking about this forever. I mean, you have the fragments of them all over the place. I mean, what is going on here?
Well, look, what's going on is a really frightening development, and it's something we should be talking about. Just barely a year ago, when Russia invaded, and there were reports that the Russians were using cluster bombs. Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, was asked about it, and she said in her response that this is possibly a war crime. using cluster bombs. And the reason for that is the cluster bombs are so indiscriminate. They explode above the earth and then spread their damage, not just on a target, but across a broad space. And many of them don't explode. The little clustered bomblets land on the ground. And then for years, even decades after, children playing in a field come upon one and it explodes. And it does them great harm or even kills them. And so the evil of cluster bombs has been well recognized. 123 nations around the world have supported a ban on them. Unfortunately, Russia still has a stock. The United States still has a stock. And in this year from when Jen Psaki was talking about the use of cluster bombs as a war crime, potential war crime, the United States has moved to a place where we are now reportedly and confirmed transferring cluster bombs to the Ukrainians. And so we are dealing in these weapons, and we shouldn't be. It is wrong. And this is one of the lessons if we go back to Reverend Jackson's campaigns in 84 and 88. He talked about military interventions, and he talked about the weapons we use. He spoke so clearly, so much more clearly than other political figures about the threat of nuclear war and the need to address that threat, but also the breadth of all sorts of weapons that were indiscriminate and horrific in their potential. And so what we see today is that there's a debate going on in America. It's not being amplified as loudly. It should be something we're talking about in Congress. It should be something we're talking about in our media. And that is whether this is appropriate. My answer is no, it's not appropriate. Other people may differ. But that debate should be had. And I give immense credit today to some people who, by the way, have roots in the Jackson campaign. Barbara Lee, especially, as best I can tell, the first person to speak out as a Democrat and as a United States Senate candidate in California. She's got, there's some risk in standing up to a president of your own party. And yet Barbara Lee spoke out and said, this is just wrong. It is wrong for the United States to be transferring cluster bombs to Ukraine. You can support the Ukrainian people. You can, recognize their struggle. You can be critical of Russia, but there has to be a better way. You can't go down to this level of weaponry. And she is not alone in this. To their immense credit, Ilhan Omar and several other members of Congress have proposed an amendment to the NDAA, the defense budget, saying that cluster munitions cannot be utilized or transferred or distributed. So she's strongly, putting this language in there. And a group of members of Congress, Pramila Jayapal, Mark Pocan, and many members of the squad have signed a letter in which a statement in which they declare and make clear that while they are sympathetic to the cause of Ukraine, that this is a step too far. And that's really, really important because, again, going back to the Jackson campaign in 84 and 88, at some point you have to assert both the moral and the practical. We understand that there's a demand in any circumstance for practical responses and realistic responses, and people can debate what they are, but understand that. But there also has to be an equal commitment to a moral sense, to a sense of what is right and wrong. And at some point, you have to say that certain weapons, even if you accept the idea of war, and many of us are ill at ease with war in general, but no matter about it, certain weapons cannot become a part of our warfare, because if they do, they will do immense damage to other soldiers, right, to soldiers of another side, but in fact to civilians, and especially to children. And that's why Human Rights Watch and other groups around the world have called for a ban on bombs. It's why the United Nations is leading an effort to ban cluster bombs. And it is why Barbara Lee, again, a Jackson supporter over the years, Barbara Lee is saying that instead of transferring cluster bombs to Ukraine, the United States should be signing on to the global accord that bans cluster bombs, and we should be putting pressure on Russia to do the same.
We're talking with John Nichols of The Nation magazine. He will be joining us in Chicago as we look at the 40th anniversary of Reverend Jackson's iconic campaigns. He was there at the beginning, everybody. He's one of the building blocks. And we've got to talk, we're talking about this campaign because what was true then is true now, even as we watch the political sands continue to shift. The BRICS nations are coming together, they're de-dollarizing, and we see NATO really fighting for significance, and I can't help but wonder what's going on, because now seeing all of these border states with Russia that are now NATO nations, and I'm wondering what's going to come of that. I mean, because that was the agreement when Germany and West and East Germany came back together, that would not happen. And that, to me, you should be a person of your word now, because we would not have hostile nations to our north and our south. I'm just saying what's good for the goose is good for the goose.
Well, it's deeper than that. And you're right, of course, and I don't want to be one of those people that diminishes the point by saying there's more to it. Your core point is the vital one, and that is exactly right. One thing I would add to it is this long-term understanding that a militarized Europe is going to be a place of tension, of course, but also a place of ongoing threat. And what we want to look toward is a demilitarization, right? We want to look for ways to get rid of the nuclear warheads. And remember, if we could think back again to Reverend Jackson's campaign, that was 1983, 1984. At that time, there was a huge movement in Germany, an anti-nuclear movement that was rooted in their concern about a potential nuclear war that would be focused on Europe. 40 years later, 40 years on, we still have these concerns. And it's certainly appropriate to point to Russia and say that actions that Russia has taken have been dangerous, damaging, frightening, and some of what Vladimir Putin has said has been deeply unsettling. But we should also recognize that part of what makes it so unsettling is this back and forth, right? The notion that Russia has a huge stockpile of nuclear weapons. The United States has a huge stockpile of nuclear weapons. And so much of it looks to be targeted on particularly Europe, right? And particularly focused in Europe. And so NATO is a powerful force, and there's a great deal of interest in NATO. And I would even go so far as to say there are points where NATO does some good. But we should also recognize that NATO has historically been a subject of legitimate debate. And this question, you want to have NATO be so expansive that it goes to the border of Russia.
But wait, didn't
the tensions that extend from that. Go ahead.
No. You're right, but I keep going back to General, then President Eisenhower, who's a 10-year experiment. If after 10 years we still have NATO, then something did not go right. Because coming out of the Second World War, that's why you had a president who was into peace. That's John Kennedy. They said every time whenever you had a nuclear threat and John and Caroline were in the White House, you knew he was not going to push the button because he had experienced it. He almost died in it, right? So I'm just trying to figure out.
He was a veteran.
He was almost died. trying to save the people, the destruction of his PT boat. So I'm just trying to find out where we are, what we're doing here. 62% of our budget goes to war and militarism. I mean, John, we are struggling in the United States here.
You're taking us back to a core concept here. And, we're talking about Reverend Jackson's campaign, as we should. But we should also recognize, Reverend Jackson ran as a Democrat. In the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower, many flaws, certainly an imperfect man, as we all of us are perfect. But Dwight Eisenhower, one of the first speeches he gave was the Cross of Iron speech, in which he talked about how every bomber we build is a school we don't build, right? It was Eisenhower, not Reverend Jackson, decades before, who made the direct connection between a Pentagon budget that was bloated and growing, becoming more and more extreme, and the lack of resources at the domestic level. Eisenhower general making that connection. It was Eisenhower also who recognized that, if it was necessary, you were going to send troops into southern states to integrate. It was Eisenhower who did the first Civil Rights Act after the post-Civil War actions in 1957, Eisenhower supporting it. It was Eisenhower who made a massive outreach to the black community, organizing black voters with Adam Clayton Powell in 1956. Adam Clayton Powell coming across from the Democrats to back Eisenhower, traveling across the country to organize black voters to vote for a Republican. So this is about bigger than Republican and Democrat. This is about fundamental values. And the fascinating thing to me is that by the 1980s, the person asserting those fundamental values was the Reverend Jesse Jackson. And we will come to celebrate Reverend Jackson in Chicago because at every point in history, we need someone to raise that banner of economic and social and racial justice and of peace. And that Jackson did, and it's one of the reasons why I'm so honored to remember his campaigns, but also so honored to carry them forward.
Honored that you were part of them. So let's be clear on that.
Well, I was lucky to be around. I was lucky to be around them. That was I count that as one of the luckiest things, one of the many lucky things in my life.
Well, let me just say that it was a blessing because that's how I met you. How about that? And CK was involved. And
one of many blessings.
It's blessings. We're going to get some closing thoughts from everybody on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel and the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. But July 14th, 15th, we're having a pure reunion. And whether you were involved in the campaign tonight, you need to come over to 930 50th Street to the push headquarters and meet John, meet Eddie Wong, meet all of these people. It was a rainbow, and it's still a rainbow. And we need to hear Dwight McKee's analysis, hear Robert Patel's analysis, hear CK's analysis. CK, who would go around the world with Reverend interpreting for him liberally because she speaks 50 languages. We got a lot to talk about. Alex, thank you for a great show today. Stay right here. I think she dreamed in French. But everybody, stay right here and get some closing thoughts from this wonderful, wonderful panel. And I love you. Can't wait to be with you tomorrow. I think that's Daddy D. That's right. Love you, everybody. So why don't you react to CK to what you heard from John? Because I remember Reverend Jackson got 78% of the black vote in 1983. Of course, that went past 95% in 1988. But you did have pushback in the black community, not overwhelming, but, some core black leadership who did come around in order to save their seats in 87. Because it was it was unexpected and it was a locomotive that blew through American politics. But, Reverend Jackson was the first person in the history in British history to be honored by the Parliament, the first non-British citizen to be honored by the Parliament for his birthday. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting was, and Keith Vaz, the longest serving person of color in the British Parliament, led the effort. And what was interesting was who was at the luncheon and who was at all events. And it was people from the extreme right and extreme left, but particularly people of color who would tell you, I'm a Tory. I'm on the right. I'm to the right of his politics. But when I saw him run, it changed me. And these were a lot of East Indians. They said, one man in particular pulled me aside. He said, look, he changed me. I want you, I don't know if I'm going to get close to Reverend today. And I walked him over to him and he almost started to cry. He said, when I saw him, I saw me. And even though politically we have our differences, he said, I will always carry that with me and I give that to my children. I needed him to put another face on power. He said, and even when I disagree with the Tories, I think of Reverend. I say, now what would he do? Do we really lose this war? I said, shh, don't say it too loud. You might lose your seat. He said, but I think about those things. And I just wanted to go around and hear from you, CK, and you, Robert, and you, Dwight, what you heard from John. Who was right there on the ground and going in these rural areas where people didn't think Reverend would go, but he did go. And he did win votes. And steadfast supporters, CK.
Well, Santita, I'm originally from Buffalo. And you remember B.W. Smith, Reverend B.W. Smith, who was part of the Rainbow family, one great, the most prolific ministers that we ever saw in Western New York, but in Buffalo. But what Reverend Jackson did in his messages that he delivered, just as John said and everyone else has said, really have not, in my impression, the impact of that have never been replicated since. He set the stage for so much. We all claim it. There never would have been a President Barack Obama but for Reverend Jesse Jackson running, showing there never would have been a woman on the Democratic ticket but for Reverend Jackson's efforts. We never would have had some of the discussions, the open discussions that we've had about sensitive issues, not just the Palestinian crisis, but also the Cuban issues with Cuba, the issues with Angola, issues with all of these countries that were perceived as communist threats, all of these nations in Africa. You never would have had that level of dialogue. You never would have had some level of dialogue with some European countries and encouraging them to do better with the people that they colonize. We know, Santita, that is as late as a couple of years ago when he received France's highest honor, the highest honor that you can convey to anyone in the military, a citizen or anyone in the military, was given to Reverend Jackson. He opened doors on so many levels, on voting rights internationally, on solidarity, the impact that Reverend Jackson and others, of course, had on the freeing of Nelson Mandela. But most importantly, and I think John talked about, when President Reagan was president, there was this notion of constructive engagement with the South African government. It was the efforts of Reverend Jackson and others. The reason why I remember that is because in 1982, I was a student at the University of Geneva, and I took classes at the Advanced Institute of International Studies, and I wrote a thesis on that. And and that's when I learned about the iconic work in 1982 in terms of sensitizing the U.S. government to why constructive engagement and all that stuff was not going to be the way for the United States to engage. And it certainly wasn't going to free Nelson Mandela and those who were in jail. So Reverend Jackson's print, his fingerprint, is more than we will ever appreciate. But understand that the Democratic Party as it exists today exists the way that it exists because of Reverend Jackson. And that we can trace back historically. That's not just people, puffing this and that. It can be traced. And that is Santita, what this conference, Rainbow Push Conference, is going to do. We say thank you to our elder statesmen who were there and who changed the fabric of this country and the world. And it's best to say thank you when they are alive. It's best to say thank you when they can say, thank you for appreciating me. It's best to say thank you when they can respond. And Reverend Jackson is the only leader that we have seen in modern day history who is in that position. He's the only civil rights leader alive today who can speak over 6 generations of making a difference internationally, globally, on all significant issues. You pick an issue, he made a difference. And I think that's what we must celebrate. But in Reverend Jackson's style, we have to have a call to action. We have to talk about what do we do in the future. See, there's a new spirit and a new level that stand on a new group that stand on the shoulders of Reverend Jackson. So what is the call to action in today's environment? And that's why, Santita, your show and other shows that are open and progressive, insofar as not being afraid to talk about difficult issues that we don't hear about, perhaps in corporate media or mainstream media, on a basis. There's a one-time story buried somewhere at the end of the day when everybody's asleep. You bring to light because we need to hear this. And this voter suppression that we're experiencing, it is as real as when you get up in the morning and you look and you see the sky is blue. Voter suppression is as real as that blue sky. I'm in Georgia. This is how we started this discussion today, Santita. This ACE bill will replicate the oppression and suppression in Georgia because they almost defeated one of the most effective senators that we've seen in the history of Georgia, Senator Raphael Warnock. They only made it. And that's because of voter suppression. It's not because of anything he did or didn't do, could do, should and shouldn't do. In fact, he's been one of the, much to the surprise of the Republicans, one of the senators who did or who has reached across the aisle. So if it can happen here in Georgia, that was, and if they had a slightly stronger candidate than Herschel Walker, we may have seen a different outcome. So the party, that model is a success. That model should be replicated, and that is why they have this legislation is being proposed. We don't need to be asleep at the wheel. Let's take the lessons and the roadmap that Reverend Jackson has given us, and we're going to salute him and thank him for that. But Reverend Jackson is not satisfied with the thanks and the accolades and all that. Not when there's so much work to be done ahead of us when the U.S. Supreme Court has stripped affirmative action. All of this is tied together. It's not by happenstance or just a coincidence. Methodical plan. And shame on us. You know, I'm not going to be mad at somebody who wins because it's been methodical, strategic, and deliberate, and we were asleep at the wheel. So shame on those of us who, many of us who weren't paying attention. Many of us were paying attention, but who weren't paying attention, but now who will pay attention.
Absolutely. Robert Patillo, your thoughts? Is Robert still there? Oh, well, John Nichols, are you still there?
I am still with you.
Okay.
I was listening to
some
brilliant words. Well, I will echo what's being said here. Look, we're a couple days away from taking some time to honor Reverend Jackson. And we all know full well that Reverend Jackson won't allow us to spend much time honoring him. He'll be telling us what the next struggle is.
Hold on one second. Right here on the phone. Dwight, were you cut?
Yeah, well, I think all cut off.
Okay, well, just stay right here because I'm going to put you on this way. But because I've got John Nichols talking, but giving us some closing thoughts. But John?
Well, yeah, all I was saying was that Reverend Jackson will undoubtedly have something new for us to do, right? He won't be satisfied to look backward. He'll always be saying, what's next? And that's his great strength. But it really matters to pause and to look back on what happened 40 years ago. Because, you know, the organizing of voters, this notion that there was a great mass of voters who, if you could just get them registered and get them to the polls, they could transform our politics. That was the core concept that we lose sight of. We were talking about all these other things, but that core concept was not as alive in that time as it is today. Today, we recognize full well that elections really are a competition for power, and that if you get your people to the polls, you've got a chance to get power, and if you get power, then you have a chance to enact the entire agenda that you're running on. Your platform becomes real. It has meaning. And Reverend Jackson communicated that concept back in the mid-1980s. And the Democratic Party had almost completely forgotten it. Let's be very, very clear. The Democratic Party was in the throes of the Democratic Leadership Conference or Council, and the DLC, which Reverend Jackson referred to as Democrats for the leisure class, was saying, well, Democrats could be just a little bit more moderate than the Republicans. They'd be pretty much like the Republicans. They could take all this corporate money. They could govern on the center right at the very best, right? And accept neoliberalism, accept neoconservatism. And Reverend Jackson said, no, that isn't how to do it. The vast majority of American people aren't there. And if we were to have a Democratic Party that would go out and organize them, the potential is endless for what we could accomplish on Medicare for all, health care, on free education, on rebuilding our cities, on converting our economy from military-industrial complex to a peace and justice complex. Reverend Jackson talked about all this. And the funny thing about it is we're only catching up to it now. Even now, 40 years on, we have political figures who still wrestle with these ideas. They're still struggling to get it. Luckily, a lot more people understand it. And I'll close off simply by saying one of the reasons why so many people today understand the genius of Reverend Jackson's message is that the people who Reverend Jackson inspired are now major political figures. People like Senator Tammy Baldwin, people like Congresswoman and potentially Senator Barbara Lee, people like Bernie Sanders. These folks were all Jackson backers back in the 1980s. They're now in positions to carry it forward and at their best. I know that Bernie Sanders says this to me all the time. At their best, they recognize that what they do today is an extension of what we did in the 1980s.
And let's
we're
not
going to
forget Jamie
gather in
Raskin.
Chicago. Jamie Raskin. I mean, look, we could go on. I could just get up in Chicago when I speak. I could just get up and read a list of names, right? Of all the people that
gets a little upset.
Mr. McKee's back on.
Because that was his first job coming out of Harvard Law School, and he wants people to know, wait a minute, I was the first general counsel for the Rainbow. He was.
Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful?
Yes.
That he's proud of that.
That's true.
That he's accomplished. That's the thing he wants us to know. Same with Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders, well, he loves talking about those Jackson campaigns in the 80s. And so I'll just close by saying that as we talk about all this, the genius of that campaign and the genius of that time, what we ought to understand is the Democratic Party that is still in formation, it still isn't what it ought to be. That Democratic Party might yet be at some point in the future, is the party of the Reverend Jesse Jackson. It is the party of the rainbow. It is a party of a politics that is bigger actually than parties and bigger actually than just practical politics. It brings a moral component to this. And that moral component is what gives us the possibility of a future with economic and social and racial justice. And as we've discussed, I think so well today, peace.
People. Dwight McKee was dropped for a hot second, but I want to give you a chance to give some closing thoughts because really that is what it's about. And that's why so many of us are here to see one another over the next few days so we can see the path forward. Because Reverend, even as he battles Parkinson's, his mind is still sharp. He is still so eager to do so much more work because he said there's so much yet to be done. I hear you all. It's okay. Don't honor me. Honor the work. Be about it. Do the work. Dwight McKee. Because you've been with Reverend Jackson since he was, I guess, the youth pastor at Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church since 1965.
Yeah, I have. And I was going to say that I think it's important for people to understand that Reverend Jackson was not just a civil rights leader. He was a peace advocate in the spirit of Dr. King and Ethel Randolph. And the reason that's so important today is because I don't think people understand that if the Ukraine is admitted to NATO, that it would be the beginning of World War III. Because the way NATO works is, as most treaties work, is that once you involved in that organization, everybody in that organization is mandated to participate in the war if you're involved in the war. And so it automatically brings Europe and the United States in direct war with Russia, who then gets involved, pulled in with China and the third world. It's really the way that World War I started. Is World War I started because of treaty relationships. As Kaiser Wilhelm got shot and Austria declared war, and once they declared war, all of their treaty nations got involved in the war. And the nations that they declared war on, Italy and Germany and all those nations got involved in war on that side. And so World War I and World War II started based on those treaty relationships. The difference between then and now, we have those treaty relationships with atomic bombs. So you're literally talking about the end of the world. And so I don't want it to go unnoticed the peace dimension of your father and Dr. King's movement and Bayard Ruskin's movement and the study war no more part of that. That's a major, that is probably have the most worldwide dimensions to our civil rights struggle as we look at what we're dealing with today.
Well, Dwight, I think you make a brilliant point because because you knew Reverend Bevel and you knew C.T. Vivian and Reverend Abernathy and so many of these stalwarts in our struggle. It wasn't desegregation that got Dr. King killed. The war on poverty, no. After he left the pulpit, having delivered the speech, voicing his public opposition to the Vietnam War, Reverend Wyatt Walker, his chief of staff, looked at him and said, "Martin, you have just signed your death certificate." He said, "I know." It was facing the military-industrial complex, staring them down. And you saw him wrestling with his conscience, and he said as much at the beginning of that speech, because he had a wife and 4 little children. Yolanda was only 11 at the time, a daughter who was barely 3. He knew what he was doing, but he said, but this is something that I have to do. I mean, my father said, "Hey, am I risking death?" Yep. But I don't want to, if I have the ability to make this world closer to what it needs to be, I'm going to do that. I don't want you to have a ceiling on your ambitions. And I want you to know that you have the power to have a just society and a peaceful world. I remember him sitting in my brother's bedroom as he sat with Jackie, who was, my sister, was she 7? She didn't know what was going on, bless her heart. She just knew there was a lot of activity in the house. But we all, Jesse, Johnny, Yusuf, and I knew what Daddy was facing. And this was the talk that we had. He said, I don't want you to have a ceiling on your ambitions. And, we had a president who, in the midst of the AIDS crisis, he did not mention AIDS, y'all. He did not mention AIDS until 1986. 1986. He became president at the beginning of 1981. We were in the throes of the AIDS crisis then. Constructive engagement with the South African government as they were mowing down Black and Indian people. Oh my gosh. And the fact is, many reports, they were afraid to touch Reagan because he was so popular and he had the polish of Hollywood and all of that. People were afraid to touch him and they didn't want to touch him. Democrats didn't. The Reverend and the Rainbow, and I have to put the people who supported him in it, John, because many of our people had to face tax audits. Our campaign manager, Arnold Pinckney, may he rest in peace, big businessman, Black businessman out of Cleveland. They tried to destroy his business, the government did, when he walked out of the campaign. Tried to destroy his business. Irene Ware, one of the biggest Black women in radio, lived under audit for the rest of her life. Because if everyone ties it to the campaign, they were like, "Would I do it again?" Of course I would. People paid a price. And so that's why I can't separate, and Reverend would never allow me to separate him and Mrs. Jackson from all the people who just cast their lot like you did with this campaign. Because we were not the mainstream then. We were not. We were not. We were not. We were the mainstream, but we were not in the mainstream. So that's why I just think it's important, to say that. Because people risked a whole lot, and some people lost a whole lot, including their lives.
Well, it was forming a new mainstream. Yeah. That was what it was about. And you know that if you look at a river, right, sometimes a river changes course. Sometimes it's flowing in one direction, and then a little bit of it breaks out and pushes off in another direction, and suddenly we've got a mighty new river, not going where we thought it was going, but going someplace else. And that's what Reverend Jackson realized. And it is, look, I don't know him as, but I think he'd be the first to acknowledge he didn't know where this was going to go. He didn't even want to be the candidate. He thought somebody else should be running.
because they were more acceptable. He said, Andy Young, you're you're mainstream. People, white folks like you.
Yeah.
Maynard Jackson.
And there was a half a dozen, right. There was a half a dozen others, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were many, many other people that in Congress and in big cities where Reverend Jackson said was much easier to run, right? They could get on the platform and be heard and be treated seriously by the media much more easily. But they wouldn't do it, and so he did it. And again, as I said, I don't think he knew where it was going. I don't think he paused to worry about that. You know, I think that's sort of the genius of Reverend Jackson. He was like, okay, you know, I'm in this, I dove in the water, I'm in this pool, I better start swimming. And the genius of it was that a lot of people who didn't have power and who didn't have any connection to, you know, what was then called the media, said, okay, if this guy's going to do it, I'm going to go too. I'm going to jump in and, you know, do the best I can. And the fascinating thing about it is that there was such media coverage was so simplistic in '84, and so, especially at that time, so limited in the attention, the analysis of what Reverend Jackson was doing. They didn't even recognize that when you looked across the country, you know, out in Iowa, you had farmers that were, you know, not just involved, but getting excited about this campaign. And in Missouri and in other places, much of the modern farm movement, the progressive populist farm movement, in the Reverend Jackson's campaign. In New York City, you had out gay men like Andy Hum, who got involved in this movement. And you know, in fact, there was a very vibrant movement of gays and lesbians supporting Reverend Jackson before. And so here you've got a campaign just at the most simplistic level, right? It's got farmers in Iowa and gay men in New York City backing the same guy. And you ask yourself, well, where is that connection being made? What's going on there? Well, the fact is, Reverend Jackson made that connection without a blink of the eye. And he called it the rainbow, right? This notion that you could have a rainbow of people from every possible background, from every possible circumstance, recognizing a moral call to make a better country. And, you know, so not that far from July 4th. I always emphasize that Reverend Jackson's campaign was a patriotic campaign. It was a campaign much like Dr. King's movement and J. Philip Randolph's movement and the movements of so many others that said, we love America enough to make it what it says it is, what we were taught it should be. And that, I think, is what connected with people all across the country, people in all kinds of circumstances, because they shared that view. Didn't matter color of the skin, religion, ethnic or racial background, didn't matter even their economic circumstance. There were people from all these different backgrounds who looked at Reverend Jackson and said, if he's willing to do this, and he's willing to raise that moral banner of economic and social racial justice and peace, we're going to go with him. And enough people went with him in '83 that '88 became possible. And enough people went with him in '88 that everything that has come since then, right, with all the voter mobilization, with all the organizing, with the election of so many people in so many places, with Bernie Sanders' campaigns in 2016 and 2020, with all that's going on right now, right, you could trace it all back to that moment, back even those moments in '83, where Reverend Jackson got up on a podium and said, here's what we're doing. Here's what we're trying to do. And people said, well, that's what I've been waiting for.
And they said, run, Jesse, run. Because this truly was a people's draft.
Yeah.
This is where you have to look at the genius.
He would have easily not made the run.
Yeah.
Yeah, he would have easily not made the run if somebody else had, if somebody else had come forward, and B, if there hadn't been a movement, because Reverend Jackson had other things to do. He had many movements he was involved in and many things he was engaged in. That making that run came at great cost. initially at least. I think in many ways now, when we look back historically, it helped to shape his legacy in ways that they're epic, and we can see it now. So boy, at the time when he got in that race, there was an element of risk, a risk of
people didn't
failure,
think he was,
right?
People didn't think that he was going to literally survive it, and that was the fear. Which is why when Minister Farrakhan said, Malcolm, Medgar, all these folks that you all have gotten, if you touch him, he'll be the last one. That's why him saying that was so important because, and in fact, there's a documentary that's being pulled together about Reverend Jackson right now. And the documentarians, some of them are reluctant to talk about the great opposition from the right wing, in the white community, in the Jewish community, to Reverend and his campaign. I mean, the two times that he was interrupted, Rabbi Meir Kahana interrupted his speech in 1983 in Washington. Now, mind you, then you had a Carolyn Kasdan, and we had a cadre of progressive Jewish people who were part of the campaign, who were like, please don't believe the hype. We got a rainbow. So that's what I'm saying. I'm always pushing back on making these blanket statements about people because you just can't do that. You really can't.
Well, can I emphasize?
Yes.
I was at rallies in 83 and 84 where I saw Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and Christians, and people of no religious background at all, non-believers, holding hands, right?
Yeah.
And singing together, right? And so what you need to understand is that the rainbow made mistakes. The rainbow was not perfect. Reverend Jackson made mistakes. He was not perfect. We recognize all of that. And yet there was a tremendous number of people who saw in that campaign a chance to own differences and to form a connection. And some of those connections from 83 and 84, they exist to this day. There are interfaith and multiracial, multi-ethnic groupings and coalitions that can trace their roots to what Reverend Jackson was doing back in the 1980s. And so, there was criticism, and there were people who attacked, and it all, and we recognize that. But we should also recognize that something amazing did happen there, and I saw it. I saw it firsthand. It's, again, like you, Santita, and like Dwight, and like so many other people on this call, having witnessed it, I think it made us all stronger in our faith that this country can overcome its differences, as fundamental and as deep and as challenging as they are, that we have actually witnessed a moment where people stood together, right? And we can never let go of that.
And that's that, everybody. Amen, amen, and amen. And I'll see you on the 14th. Getting another email from Eddie Wong, who wants everybody to come in. Bring your pictures, bring your memories. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. I love Eddie Wong. And I just, it was just, it's a wonderful family, and you're all a part of it. So whether you were in the campaign, you might have even disagreed with the campaign in real time, and then you see it differently now. Show up.
Oh, yeah.
That's okay. We're all family, and we make space for that. We make space for that. So everybody, please join us at 50th and Drexel on the 14th and the 15th and throughout the convention. You don't want to miss it. We've got a lot of work to do. I love you, John. I love you, CK. Love you, Daddy D. Boom. He's like, you all keep giving me these monikers. But love you, Alex. Thank you for a great show. Everybody, I will see you tomorrow, God willing, on the Santita Jackson Show. God bless you. Have a great one. Love y'all.